The will was read on a Thursday morning in the offices of Caldwell and Associates on the 14th floor of a glass building in downtown Seattle, and I remember the exact quality of the light that came through the windows that day because it was the kind of pale, watery February light that makes everything look slightly unreal, like a photograph taken through frosted glass. I had been to that office twice before, once when my husband and I updated our estate documents after his mother passed, and once when we added a clause about our vacation property in Cannon Beach. Both times I had sat in the same leather chair across from the same wide mahogany desk and signed documents that felt like proof of a life being built carefully and deliberately. That Thursday morning I sat in the same chair again, and someone I had never seen before walked through the door and sat down across from me, and the life I had believed I was building began to come apart at the seams in ways I am still, 3 years later, attempting to fully understand. My name is Catherine Aldridge. I was 53 years old when my husband James Aldridge died of a cardiac event on a Monday evening in November, while sitting in his home office reading a report from one of his investment accounts. He was 58. He had been told 2 years earlier that his heart required monitoring, that he should reduce his travel schedule and manage his stress more deliberately, that the kind of life he had built around 60-hour weeks and cross-country flights and back client meetings was not sustainable at the level he had been sustaining it. He had nodded during those conversations with his cardiologist, and he had bought a blood pressure monitor for the bathroom counter. And then he had continued living exactly as he had always lived because James Aldridge did not know how to be a smaller version of himself. I had loved him for that. Among many other things, we had been married for 22 years. We met at a conference in Portland in the late 90s. The kind of professional gathering where people exchange business cards and speak in shorthand about industries and markets, and only occasionally let their actual selves show through the professional surface. James let his show through almost immediately. He was funny in a way that surprised people, quick and dry and willing to be absurd in a room full of people performing seriousness. I was sitting next to him during a panel discussion that was going badly, and he leaned over and said something quietly about the speaker that made me cover my mouth to keep from laughing. And that was, as far as I can reconstruct the origins of the next 22 years. Where it began, we were married 18 months later in a small ceremony at a vineyard outside Walla Walla. There were 43 guests. My mother cried. His mother gave a toast that was technically about us but managed to include several long passages about her own marriage that everyone politely received as wisdom. James squeezed my hand under the table and looked at me with the particular expression he had that meant he was trying not to laugh. I still have that expression memorized. I will always have it memorized. We built a life that was, by any reasonable measure, a good one. We owned a home in the Queen Anne neighborhood of Seattle, a thoughtful craftsman house with a garden I maintained with more enthusiasm than skill, and a kitchen where James made elaborate Sunday breakfasts that he treated as a form of meditation. We had traveled extensively. We had close friends. We had routines that had settled into the comfortable grooves that long marriages develop, the kind where you can read a person's mood from the way they set a coffee cup down or hold a newspaper. I thought I knew James Aldridge the way you know a landscape you have lived inside for decades. Every slope and shadow familiar, every season anticipated. The woman who walked into the lawyer's office that Thursday morning was named Patricia Holt. She was 44 years old, with dark hair pulled back and the composed, braced expression of someone who has been preparing for a difficult encounter and has decided to get through it with her dignity intact. She was accompanied by a man who turned out to be her attorney, a compact, careful man named Stephen Birch, who wore his suit the way attorneys wear suits when they are about to say something that will permanently alter a room. Patricia Holt sat down on the far side of the conference table, looked at me once, looked away, and then looked at her attorney. I looked at the estate lawyer, a woman named Helen Caldwell who had handled our family's documents for 15 years. Helen's face had the controlled neutrality of a professional who has navigated difficult moments in this room before, but was making no attempt to pretend that this moment was routine. I said, "Helen, who is this?" Helen said, "Catherine, this is something James' estate has brought forward." She paused. "Patricia Holt has filed a claim against the estate on the basis of a prior marriage to James Aldridge." I sat very still for a moment. Then I said, "I am sorry." "What did you say?" Helen said it again. "Prior marriage." Prior to ours, the light through the windows had not changed. The room had not changed. Everything was exactly as it had been 30 seconds earlier. And yet I felt, in that moment, the precise sensation of the ground shifting beneath the chair I was sitting in. The way the ground shifts in those dreams where you are walking across a surface that turns out not to be solid, where each step takes you slightly further down into something you cannot name. I want to be careful here about how I describe what followed, because it is easy in retrospect to arrange events into a cleaner narrative than the one that actually unfolds when your life is reorganizing itself without your permission. What I remember is that Stephen Birch produced documents. He spoke in the measured tones of an attorney who has rehearsed his delivery carefully, to avoid seeming either apologetic or aggressive. He said that Patricia Holt and James Aldridge had been married in Clark County, Nevada, in 1994. He said that no divorce had ever been filed in Nevada or any other state. He said that James Aldridge and I had been married in 1997, at which point his marriage to Patricia Holt was still legally in effect. He said that this made my marriage to James potentially invalid under Washington state law. He said the word potentially with the careful emphasis of an attorney who wants you to understand that a great deal hinges on it. I looked at Helen. Helen looked at her desk. I looked at Patricia Holt, who was looking at a point somewhere to the left of my face, and I understood from the quality of her composure that she was doing the same thing I was doing, which was trying to hold herself together in a room where the simple act of falling apart would cost her something she could not afford to lose. My attorney was not in that room. I had not brought one because I had not known I would need one. I had come to hear my husband, Will read. I had come as his wife of 22 years. I had come as the person who had found him in his home office on a Monday evening in November, and had understood from the way he was sitting, very still, slightly tilted, the report still in his hands, that something had gone permanently and irrevocably wrong. I had come as the person who had loved him. I stood up from the table. I told Helen I would need to reschedule this meeting. I told Stephen Birch that any further communications should go through my attorney, whose name I would provide shortly. I did not look at Patricia Holt again. As I gathered my coat and my bag, I walked to the elevator and pressed the button and stood there watching the numbers descend, and doing the breathing exercise my doctor had taught me for moments of high stress. The kind of slow-counted breathing that is supposed to interrupt the body's panic response. It works imperfectly, but it gives you something to do with your hands. In the elevator alone, going down 14 floors, I allowed myself 30 seconds of something that was not quite crying but was adjacent to it. Then the doors opened onto the lobby, and I walked out into the February light, and I began trying to understand what had just happened to me. James Aldridge, my husband, the man who made elaborate Sunday breakfasts, and had a dry, quick sense of humor, and squeezed my hand under tables at formal dinners, and told me once, on a trip to Kyoto in our 10th year of marriage, that he could not imagine what his life would have looked like without me in it. That man had been married to someone else when he married me. Not briefly, not as a young mistake that was cleanly resolved before we met. He had married Patricia Holt in 1994. We had met in 1997. We had married in 1997, which meant that when James Aldridge stood beside me at that vineyard outside Walla Walla and exchanged vows in front of 43 people including my mother who cried and his mother who gave a long toast, he was still, under the law, married to someone else. I did not understand, in those first days, how a person holds that information. I did not know where to put it. There is no existing architecture in your life for a revelation of that kind. You cannot simply slot it into your understanding of the person you loved and arrive at a coherent picture. What you get instead is a kind of internal static, a continuous low-frequency noise that runs beneath everything else you are trying to think or feel or do, that says the ground you are standing on is not what you believed it was, and you are not sure yet how far down it actually goes. I called my friend Miriam the evening after the will reading. Miriam had known James and me for 15 years. She was the kind of friend who arrives when you call without asking for details first. She came to my house on Queen Anne and sat with me in the kitchen while I told her everything. And she listened the way good listeners listen, without filling the silences, without rushing to conclusions, without offering solutions before the problem was fully described. When I finished, she said, "Catherine, what do you need right now?" I said, "I need an attorney, and I need to understand what happened." She said, "Okay. Let us start with the attorney." The attorney I found was a woman named Diane Osei who practiced family and estate law in Seattle, and had a reputation, which several people confirmed to me independently, for being extraordinarily thorough in situations where the facts of a case were more complicated than they first appeared. Diane was 57 years old with close, cropped natural hair and the particular quality of stillness that very capable people sometimes have. The kind that makes you understand that nothing you tell them will be the strangest thing they have heard this week. She listened to everything I knew, which was not much at that point, and then she said she wanted 48 hours to do some preliminary research before we mapped out a strategy. She called me back in 36 hours. What she had found was this: James Aldridge and Patricia Holt had been married in Clark County, Nevada, on the 8th of April 1994. The marriage had been real, legally executed, witnessed, and recorded. Patricia Holt had kept her name. James had returned to Seattle, where he was living at the time, and continued his life. 3 years later, he had met me at a conference in Portland. He had courted me with the kind of focused, specific attention that I had found entirely believable, because it was entirely consistent with everything else I knew about how James approached things he cared about. He had not told me about Nevada. He had married me in Washington state, on a marriage license that required him to declare his marital status, on which he had declared himself single. He had been lying from the very beginning. Diane let me sit with that for a moment after she said it. Then she said, "Here is what we need to understand." She said there were two separate questions before us. The first was the question of my marital status, specifically whether my marriage to James was legally valid, and what my rights were as a result of whatever the answer turned out to be. The second was the question of what Patricia Holt actually wanted, and what was behind her appearance in that conference room. "Why does that second question matter?" I asked. Diane said, "Because in my experience, when someone appears at an estate reading 22 years after a marriage that was never dissolved, they are not there because they have been silently waiting all this time out of loyalty to a legal technicality. They are there because someone told them to be there, or because something has recently changed, or because they have a specific objective that is worth understanding before we decide how to respond to it." I looked at her across the desk. "What do you mean by someone told them to be there?" Diane said. "I mean, I would like to know who Patricia Holt's attorney is and where he came from." "Stephen Birch," I said. She wrote the name down. She said she would look into it. What she found over the following 2 weeks changed the entire shape of the story I was trying to understand. But first, let me tell you what those 2 weeks were like to live inside, because I think that part matters as much as the legal proceedings, and it is the part that tends to get compressed or skipped in the interest of moving the narrative forward, when in fact the slow, difficult dailiness of it is where the real weight of the experience lives. I continued going to work. I was the director of development for a nonprofit arts foundation that I had helped build over 14 years, and there were campaigns running and donor relationships to maintain in a board meeting in early March, for which I was responsible for a significant portion of the presentation. The work helped. It gave my mind somewhere to be that was not the question that was otherwise occupying every available space in my thinking, which was how I had lived inside a 22-year marriage without knowing the truth about the person I was living with. I went through his things, not systematically, not with any plan, just the ordinary sorting that follows a death, the slow going through of a person, belongings that is both practical and unbearable in equal measure. His home office, his side of the closet, the drawer in the bedside table where he kept small items that did not have other homes, a spare watch battery, a folded note from a hotel in Hong Kong I did not recognize, 3 guitar picks for a guitar I did not know he still played. These objects, each one ordinary on its own, together made a mosaic of a person I was suddenly looking at from a new angle, trying to understand what I had not seen, what I had not thought to look for, what had been present all along in plain sight. There was no dramatic revelation in those drawers. No hidden letters, no second phone, no evidence of a secret life running parallel to ours. James Aldridge had not been living a double life in the conventional sense. He had not maintained a relationship with Patricia Holt through our marriage. What he had done was simpler, and in some ways stranger. He had simply never resolved what happened in Nevada. He had married her, and then he had left, and he had not gone back, and he had not filed papers, and he had not, apparently, thought that this would one day become someone else's problem to carry. Or perhaps he had thought about it. Perhaps he had thought about it and decided it was easier not to think about it. I have spent a great deal of time in the 3 years since wondering which of those is true, and I do not have a clean answer, and I have arrived at the conclusion that I may never have one, and that I need to be at peace with that. Diane called me on a Thursday, 2 weeks after our first meeting. She said she wanted to come to my house rather than have me come to the office. I understood from that choice that what she had found was significant enough that she wanted me to receive it somewhere. I felt stable. She came in the early evening and sat across from me at the kitchen table where James had made his elaborate Sunday breakfasts, and she put a thin folder on the table between us and said, "I need to tell you some things, and I need you to listen to all of them before you respond, because they connect to each other in a way that only makes sense when you hear them in order." I said. "All right," she said. "Stephen Birch, the attorney representing Patricia Holt, is a partner in a firm that has worked extensively with a man named Gordon Fells." I did not recognize that name. "I said so," Diane said. "Gordon Fells is a former business partner of James S. They had a professional relationship that ended badly approximately 8 years ago. There was a dispute over intellectual property related to an investment analytics platform that James had been developing. The dispute was settled privately, but according to several people I spoke with who were aware of it, Fells believed the settlement was not in his favor and carried that grievance forward. I sat with that for a moment. "You think this is connected?" I said. Diane said, "I think it is worth noting that Gordon Fells and Stephen Birch share a professional network, that Patricia Holt had made no legal moves regarding her marriage to James in the 20+ years since it occurred, and that she retained Stephen Birch's firm within 3 weeks of James's death being publicly announced in his company's press release." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the neighbor's dog was doing something in the yard. "A car passed on the street," I said. "So someone told her about James's death and suggested she had a claim." Diane said, "That is my working theory." "And Patricia Holt," I asked, "does she know she is being used?" Diane was quiet for a moment. "That," she said, "is the question I cannot fully answer from the outside. What I can tell you is that Patricia Holt is a woman who was married for what appears to have been a very short time to a man who then disappeared from her life without legal resolution. She may have genuine grievance about that. She may have legitimate feelings about never having been properly released from that marriage. She may also be someone who has been told a particular story about what she is owed and what this legal action could get her. I do not know which of those is primary." "What does she want?" I asked. "Specifically, what is she claiming?" Diane said. "She is claiming that because my marriage to James was legally invalid, she holds the status of legal spouse. And as his legal spouse, she is entitled to a share of the estate under Washington state law." "What share?" I asked. Diane said, "Depending on how it was argued and how the court ruled, potentially a significant one." I sat back in my chair. The kitchen felt different in that moment than it had felt 5 minutes earlier. Which is a strange thing to say about a room that had not changed at all, but grief and shock do something to the quality of familiar spaces. They make you see the surfaces of things, instead of the comfortable, invisible whole. I thought about James, who had made coffee in this kitchen approximately 8,000 times over 22 years, who had a specific way of grinding the beans that he considered important, and a specific way of pouring that he also considered important, who had opinions about coffee that were somewhat too numerous for the subject. I thought about the fact that he had lived in this kitchen with me all that time while carrying a legal fact that would have changed everything, and that he had apparently decided, for reasons I would never fully understand, not to carry it out loud where I could hear it. I thought about Patricia Holt sitting across from me in that conference room, with her composed and braced expression, who was also carrying something she had not chosen, who was also trying to navigate a situation that someone else's choices had created. And then I thought about Gordon Fells, who I had never met, who had apparently decided that a dead man's wife was a useful instrument for settling a grievance that had nothing to do with her. I said to Diane, "What do we do?" Diane opened the folder, she said. "We do several things simultaneously, and we do them carefully, and we document everything." What followed over the next 2 months was the most methodical period of my adult life. Diane filed the appropriate motions to establish my legal standing in the estate proceedings. She engaged a forensic accountant to review the full structure of James' estate, which was more complex than I had realized. James had been quietly, carefully organized about his finances in ways I had known broadly but not in detail, which was a division of labor we had settled into over the years without examining it closely. The forensic accountant's review was thorough and took 3 weeks. While that review was underway, Diane pursued the question of Gordon Fels and Stephen Birch's connection with the specificity of someone who has decided that understanding a thing fully is more useful than understanding it partially. She spoke with 2 former colleagues of James who had direct knowledge of the Fels dispute. She obtained documentation of the professional relationship between Birch's firm and Fels' company. She also, through channels she declined to detail precisely, but which she indicated were entirely legal, made contact with a woman who had worked as a legal secretary at Birch's firm 3 years earlier, who had since left the firm under circumstances that had not been entirely amicable, and who had certain recollections about specific conversations that had taken place in that office in the weeks following James's death. The secretary's name was Angela. She was 31 years old and was willing to provide a formal statement. Her statement described a conversation she had witnessed in Stephen Birch's office in which a man she identified from a photograph as Gordon Fels had discussed the potential leverage that could be generated by bringing forward a prior marriage claim against the Aldridge estate. She described Birch explaining to Fels the specific legal exposure this would create for the current wife's inheritance position. She described Fels describing Patricia Holt as someone he had located through his own research, who could be persuaded to participate if the potential financial gain was presented correctly. Persuaded, that was the word Angela used. Diane put Angela's statement in the folder with everything else and then arranged a meeting with the opposing attorneys, at which she placed the folder on the table and said, "Before we proceed to court, I think we should discuss the full picture." I was not in that meeting. Diane told me about it afterward, sitting in my kitchen again with the same folder between us, now significantly thicker than it had been on her first visit. She said Birch had listened without expression while she walked through the documentation. She said Fels had not been in the room, but that she had made clear she was aware of his involvement. She said that when she finished presenting everything she had, the room was quiet for a long time, and then Birch had said he needed to speak with his client. That was on a Wednesday. By Friday, Patricia Holt had a different attorney. Her new attorney was a woman named Carol Sims, who called Diane that same Friday and said that her client wished to discuss a different approach to the estate matter. Carol Sims' voice, Diane told me, sounded like someone who has just been given a case that is considerably messier than it was described to her, and who is trying to be professional about it while she figures out exactly how messy it actually is. The court hearing was scheduled for the 3rd week of March. By the time we sat down in King County Superior Court, the shape of the proceedings had changed significantly from what Patricia Holt's original filing had proposed. Carol Sims had spent 2 weeks getting fully briefed on what her client actually knew about the events that had brought her to this point. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, practical and unadorned, the kind of room that has seen too much real human difficulty to bother with atmosphere. The judge was a man named Raymond Cho who wore his authority the way experienced judges wear it, like something he has had long enough that it fits without effort. He had a habit of making brief, precise notes in the margins of documents while attorneys were speaking, and he did not look up when he did it, which gave you the slightly unnerving impression that he was doing 2 things at once and doing both of them well. I sat beside Diane at our table. Patricia Holt sat beside Carol Sims at theirs. She looked different than she had in the lawyer's office in February. The composed, braced quality was still there, but underneath it was something else now, something that looked like exhaustion. The specific exhaustion of someone who has been carrying weight they did not fully understand, and has recently had it explained to them. Carol Sims addressed the court first. She said that her client wished to revise the basis of her claim significantly from what had been originally filed. She said that Patricia Holt had entered these proceedings on the advice of counsel, and under certain assumptions about the situation that she now understood were not fully accurate. She said that her client was not seeking to challenge the standing of Catherine Aldridge as the primary beneficiary of the Aldridge estate. Judge Cho looked up from his notes. "That is a significant revision from the original filing, Miss Sims." "Yes, Your Honor," Carol Sims said. "My client's position has evolved as she has become more fully informed of the circumstances surrounding the original legal advice she received. Evolved. It was a careful word for what had actually happened, which was that Patricia Holt had learned that she had been identified, located, and recruited as a legal instrument by a man with a grudge, and that the attorney she had originally trusted had been serving 2 clients simultaneously, only one of whom was her. Judge Cho asked Carol Sims to clarify what her client was seeking, if not a challenge to my standing. Carol Sims said that her client was seeking formal legal resolution of her marriage to James Aldridge, specifically, a posthumous annulment of that marriage through the proper legal process, which would clarify her status and allow her to move forward with her own life without carrying the legal ambiguity that James Aldridge's choices had imposed on her. She also sought a modest acknowledgement from the estate to cover her legitimate legal costs in pursuing that resolution. Judge Cho looked at Diane, Miss Osei. Diane stood. She said that her client did not oppose the annulment proceeding, which she agreed served the legitimate interest of legal clarity for both parties. She said that the question of legal costs could be addressed in a manner that reflected the actual history of the proceedings, including the documented involvement of a third party who had manipulated both women for his own financial purposes. There was a pause. Judge Cho looked between the 2 attorneys. Then he looked at me, then at Patricia Holt. He had the expression of a judge who has read enough of the file to understand what had actually happened here, underneath the legal filings. He said, "This court has reviewed the documentation submitted by Miss Osei regarding the involvement of a third party in the original filing of this claim." He said it with the measured neutrality of a judge who is choosing his words carefully, because what they represent is serious. He said, "That matter is not within the direct scope of today's proceeding, but I am noting it formally in the record of this case, and I am referring the relevant documentation to the appropriate authorities for review of potential ethics violations and possible tortious interference." He looked at both attorneys again. He said, "I want to be clear about what this court has before it today. On one side is a woman who is married to a man who had already married someone else, who then left that someone else without legal resolution, who spent 22 years building a life with a second woman, and who died without ever addressing the legal situation he had created. On the other side is a woman who was legally married to that same man, legally abandoned without resolution, and who was recently contacted by parties who saw her unresolved legal status as an instrument for their own purposes." He paused. "Both of these women," he said, "are in this courtroom because of choices made by a man who is no longer here to answer for them. I want that understood as the context for how this court will proceed." The room was very quiet. The posthumous annulment of James Aldridge's 1994 marriage to Patricia Holt was processed through the appropriate legal channels over the following 6 weeks. My marriage to James was confirmed as legally valid under Washington State's good faith marriage doctrine, which protects spouses who enter a marriage without knowledge of a prior undissolved marriage. The estate proceeded to distribution as James's will had specified, which named me as primary beneficiary. A portion of the legal costs incurred by Patricia Holt in the proceedings related to third-party involvement were covered by a settlement reached with Gordon Fells, which Diane negotiated with the particular satisfaction of an attorney who has been waiting for the right moment to place a specific set of documents on a specific person's desk. I want to tell you about the conversation I had with Patricia Holt, because that is, for me, the part of this story that matters most, and it is the part that took the most courage to initiate and the most honesty to sit inside. I called her 3 weeks after the court hearing. I had her number because Carol Sims had provided it with the quiet suggestion that a conversation might be worthwhile when both parties were ready. I sat in my kitchen for a long time with the phone in my hand before I called. It was an April evening by then, and the light through the kitchen windows was different than it had been in February, fuller and longer, the particular quality of early spring light in the Pacific Northwest that comes as a relief after the months of gray. Patricia answered on the 3rd ring. She said hello in the voice of someone who had been expecting this call and had not entirely decided how they felt about it. I said, "This is Catherine Aldridge." She said, "I know." I said, "I am calling because I think we were both treated badly by someone who used both of us, and I did not want to let that stand as the last word on what happened between us." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I didn't know about you. When I married him, I didn't know he had someone else." I said, "I know that." She said, When they came to me after he died, they made it sound like you had known, like it had been a deliberate situation. They made it sound like I had been wrong deliberately and that you were part of it. I said, I understand, she said. I was wrong deliberately, just not by you. I said yes. And so was I. Another silence. Outside my kitchen window, a bird was doing something complicated in the garden. I had been trying for years to maintain a garden that my mother would have approved of, with mixed results, Patricia said. What was he like? Her voice was careful around the question. Not aggressive, just genuinely wanting to know. I thought about how to answer that honestly. I said, he was funny. He was smart in the particular way that makes you feel smarter when you are around someone. He was specific about things that did not require specificity, like coffee, and generous about things that did. He worked too hard and he did not always tell me what he was thinking, and he was better at making plans than he was at sitting still. I paused. I said, he was also a man who made at least one decision in his life that he should have faced and didn't, and whose not facing it became something that hurt people who trusted him. Both of us in different ways, Patricia said. Do you hate him for it? I sat with that question for a while. I said, I do not think hate is the right word. I think I grieve the gap between who I believed he was and what I now know he carried. I think those two things can both be true. That he loved me genuinely and that he failed me in this specific, serious way. She said, that sounds like something a person says when they have thought about it for a long time. I said, I have thought about it for a very long time. We talked for nearly an hour. We talked about Nevada, which she told me had been a quick, intense courtship that ended almost as soon as it formalized, that she had been 25 and had made a decision she understood almost immediately was not right, and that when James left she had been relieved more than heartbroken, and had assumed he would eventually send papers, and had waited, and then had stopped waiting, and had eventually moved forward into her own life without looking back. She had married again in 2003 to a man named David, with whom she had 2 children and a good life in Spokane. She had never thought seriously about James Aldridge again until Stephen Birch's firm had called her last December. She said Birch had told her that James had recently died, and that she had a legal claim that deserved resolution. He had said she had been wronged by being legally abandoned and never released from the marriage. He had said she was entitled to acknowledgement of that wrong from the estate. He had framed it as a matter of justice, of correcting something that had been unfair to her. He had not mentioned Gordon Fells. He had not told her that the call was motivated by anything other than concern for her legal interests. He had not told her that there was a woman named Catherine who had spent 22 years building a life with James and who would be sitting across the table from her in a lawyer's office. Blindsided, Patricia said. If I had known about you, if someone had told me there was a wife, she stopped. I would not have agreed to any of it. I want you to know that. I said, I believe you. She said, I am sorry. For the part that was mine, even though I didn't fully understand what I was doing. I am sorry it hurt you, I said. I know. We were quiet for a moment, then I said, for what it is worth, I think what happened to you in 1994 was also unfair. He should have sent papers, you deserve to be properly released. Whatever his reasons were, you should not have had to carry that for 30 years without resolution. She said, thank you. I appreciate you saying it, I said. I mean it. Before we ended the call, she said something that has stayed with me. She said, he must have loved you very much to have built what he built with you. Whatever else he was someone who spent 22 years building something real. I hope you hold on to that part. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long time after we said goodbye. What I have come to understand, in the 3 years since that February morning in the glass building on the 14th floor, is something I could not have articulated clearly while I was inside it. It is the understanding that a person can love you genuinely and also fail you specifically. That these two things do not cancel each other out. That grief is not simple and that people are not simple, and that 22 years of a life built together is not erased by the discovery of something that was concealed, but it is changed, and the changed thing takes time to understand. James Aldridge loved me. I believe that without reservation. He was also a man who made a decision in his 20s that he was afraid to face, and who kept not facing it year after year until the not facing it became simply the way things were. A fact buried deep enough that it did not disturb the surface of his daily life. I do not think he chose this deliberately as a cruelty. I think he was afraid, and then he was more afraid, and then so much time had passed that facing it felt impossible, and so he never did. I understand that kind of fear. I do not excuse it. But I understand it. What I cannot excuse, and what I spent considerable energy addressing through legal means, is what Gordon Fells did. Fells had looked at a dead man's unresolved legal detail, and had seen in it an opportunity to wound someone who had nothing to do with his grievance, using a woman who also had nothing to do with it as the instrument. He had taken two people's genuine pain, two women who had both been affected by the same man's choices, and had attempted to weaponize it for his own purposes. The referral that Judge Cho made to the appropriate authorities resulted, after a review process that took several months, in a formal complaint being filed against Stephen Birch with the Washington State Bar Association for failure to disclose a conflict of interest, and for representing a client whose interests were in material conflict with an undisclosed third party. The investigation is ongoing as of this writing. Fells himself faces a civil claim for tortious interference with the estate proceedings, which Diane continues to pursue with the specific, organized patience that characterizes everything she does. I did not set out to pursue those outcomes as revenge. I pursued them because I think accountability matters, and because the same quality of methodical honesty that helped me understand what had happened to my marriage also made me unwilling to let what Fells had done stand without consequence. There is a difference between choosing not to punish people and allowing people to use you as a tool without response. I was willing to forgive a great deal. I was not willing to be used. In the spring of the year following the court proceedings, I created a small fund in James's name through my foundation, one that specifically supports legal aid for individuals navigating complex estate and family law situations. Without resources, I made that choice because the experience had shown me, more clearly than anything else in my adult life, that the law as it intersects with death and grief in family is a place where people are extraordinarily vulnerable, and where the presence or absence of good legal support makes an enormous difference to what happens to them. I also made a more personal choice. I took one of James's guitar picks, the ones from the drawer in the bedside table, and I kept it. Not as a memorial to a perfect person, as a reminder that people are the sum of many things, and that love is not the same as knowing everything, and that both of those realities can live inside the same life without destroying each other. The house on Queen Anne is still mine. The garden is still imperfect. The kitchen where James made elaborate Sunday breakfasts is now where I make simpler ones, and where I sometimes sit in the early morning with coffee and let the light come through the windows and let myself hold all of it. The 22 years and the February morning in the phone call with Patricia and the judge, careful words in the guitar pick on the windowsill, and let it be the complicated, unresolved, genuinely lived thing that it is. I do not have a clean lesson to offer from this experience, which is not entirely satisfying but is, I think, honest. What I have are the things I now know that I did not know before. I know that the people we love are always partly unknown to us, and that this is not a failure of love but a fact about persons. I know that grief and anger and love can coexist in the same chest without canceling each other out. I know that two people who have both been hurt by the same person's choices can speak to each other with honesty and even kindness, and that doing so is more useful than treating each other as adversaries. I know that when someone tries to use your grief as a weapon, the most powerful thing you can do is understand exactly what they are doing before they expect you to, and respond with more clarity than they anticipated. And I know that a good attorney, one who is thorough and methodical and willing to follow the evidence wherever it leads, and who comes to your house with a folder on an April evening, and puts it on the kitchen table and says, "Let me tell you what I found," is among the most valuable people you will ever encounter in the hardest year of your life. The February light through those 14th floor windows, the pale watery light that made everything look slightly unreal, that light was telling me something I was not yet ready to hear. It was telling me that the solid ground I had believed I was standing on was something more complex than solid ground, something that had history and shadow in it that I had not known to look for. It took time to stand on that ground without feeling it shift, but squarely, clearly, with the full knowledge of what it is and what it is not. James Aldridge was my husband for 22 years. He loved me in the ways that he was capable of loving, which were real and many. He also failed me in a way that was serious and that I deserved better than. Both of those things are true. Both of those things belong to me now, as part of the story of my life, which I am still, gratefully, in the process of living. If this story has found you in a moment when you are trying to understand something about the person you loved, or trusted, or built your life beside, I want you to hear this. The discovery of what someone concealed does not erase what they built with you. It changes it, and the changed thing is harder to carry than the unchanged thing, and it takes longer to understand. But it is still yours. The life you built is still yours. No document, no prior marriage, no third party with a grievance, and no February morning in a glass building on the 14th floor can take from you the 22 years that were genuinely lived. What you do with the truth, once you have it, is the only question that remains. And that question, unlike the ones that came before it, is entirely yours to answer.